What's it like to go from waitressing and working at Lululemon to working in the Obama White House at age 26? Beck Dorey-Stein will be here to talk about her new memoir, From the Corner of the Oval Office. How did three aristocratic women shape salon culture in Fin-De-Siècle Paris? Caroline Weber will be here to tell us about her latest book, Proust's Duchess. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the publishing world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Beck Dorey-Stein joins us now. Her memoir is From the Corner of the Oval. Beck, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right. So you got a job in the White House through Craigslist. I maybe I have like a 2004 conception of Craigslist, but I think of it as like a place to sell like a sofa that you just want someone to, pick up and get rid of.
I got a really good toaster from there.
Okay. But you also got a job in the White House. How does that happen?
I did. So in 2012, I was working 5 part-time jobs. I was working at Lululemon 20 hours a week. I was waitressing and I was tutoring. And I applied to 10 jobs a day just trying to make rent. One of the jobs was to be a stenographer in a law firm. And I actually blew off the interview because my shift at Lululemon ran late and I was aspiring to be a manager someday. That was where my life was going to take me.
You wanted to be a manager at Lululemon?
That was sort of like the big goal at the time. Yeah, I was, pacing myself and I blew off the interview, wrote an email apologizing, withdrawing my application. And this woman actually wrote back. I assumed she was going to say, "You're a horrible, irresponsible person. You're never going to get a job anywhere." And instead she actually said, "For transparency's sake, this is a job at the White House and you'd be traveling with the president." And my first thought was, president of what? And it was the job at the White House as his stenographer.
So the trick to getting a job at the White House is to blow off your interview.
Totally.
Because you're working in an athletic wear store.
What's so funny is I had been doing everything right. And that was the one time that I just went off the grid as far as protocol in DC. I had been showing up to interviews early. I had been spending money I didn't have to have my hair blow dried. And this was just like, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I withdraw my application and that's when it worked. So yeah, drop out of college, apply to jobs on Craigslist.
So, okay, you get to your interview, which you now know is a job at the White House. I mean, were you nervous? What was that like?
I was so nervous because I'd blown off the first interview. So the fact that this woman was giving me a second chance, I was like, there's no way I'm getting it. And now it's just going to get that much closer to having had a really cool job that it's my fault. And so I actually just sort of continued with this bizarre attitude of, okay, this is DC. Nothing has been going my way. So I came in with a cup of coffee, which I never would have just like casually walked in with a cup of coffee, but I was like, there's no way she's going to give me this job. And yet she did. And I got to sit down and she explained she usually gets stenographers from the State Department. Mm-hmm. They didn't have any. She was an older woman. She wasn't quite sure where to find people. Her teenage son had suggested Craigslist and she had gone with it. And because I had been teaching at Sidwell Friends, where the Obama girls attended, she thought I might be a good fit.
And you were 26 at the time?
Yes.
So what does a stenographer do? It's like one of those mid-20th century words that I think people assume, well, that doesn't exist anymore.
Absolutely. Cat-eye glasses, beehive hairdo. I didn't think so either. Our job, unlike a law firm or courtroom stenographer where they can type in real time and they have those little tiny typewriters, we were hired more to be discreet and we didn't type in real time. I can't type in real time. I don't know how to use shorthand. We go in, we put down our recorders, we record the president's public remarks. Anytime the press is in the room, we're in the room as well. And also the daily press briefing and statements and speeches. And then we go into our little office and we type it up and we provide the transcripts for the White House and the Presidential Archive.
So what is a typical day, like what it looked like?
There was no typical day in the White House. And anytime you were like, okay, today's going to be relatively easy, I might even get to make it to my friend's party, which never happens, then something crazy would happen. But we would always have our schedule up on this whiteboard in our little tiny office. And
when you say we, how many of the White House stenographers are there?
And there are 5 White House stenographers, 3 for the president, 1 for the vice president, and 1 for the first lady.
And why are there 3? Is it like in case one of you doesn't catch something, or how does that work? Or do you divvy it up?
So there are 3 because the president is so busy, or President Obama was very busy. He was a workhorse. And yeah, there was no way we could all keep up. And this way, if he had one event, we would go there and then we would stage a different stenographer at his next event, because then if I were at the first event, I would run back with a recorder and start typing up that transcript.
For you at 26 to sort of be constantly confronted in the moment or right after the moment with these very tragic events and just the constant news cycle, did it become overwhelming?
I just took my cues from President Obama, and he was really good at compartmentalizing and only focusing on what he could do. And so that's what I tried to do. I wasn't nearly as good as he was. I don't know how he stayed so composed and poised. I was often kind of losing it when I could in the Press One van in the motorcade. It was like that was when you were allowed to fall apart.
Like, what was the worst moment for you?
Newtown. Newtown was really, I guess that was the beginning, because then later Charleston. It's weird to rank these shooting, as far as they're all horrible in their own right. But Newtown was such a shock to the system, and I had been there not very long. And to go up to Newtown and see those families and just hear that, it was beyond heartbreaking. And it's just like, if Congress were paying more attention and listening to those people and meeting with them, I don't know how we haven't had legislation passed already.
So when you go there, you have a recorder. You're recording what the president says. Are you recording what everyone else says? Or is it you're strictly keeping a record of what he says?
No, we keep a record of everyone. So especially in off-the-record briefings in the Roosevelt Room, which is the room right across from the Oval Office, President Obama would often hold meetings in there with reporters. And it was really funny because I would get to put down all my recorders and the press wasn't allowed to record it. And so they would just look longingly at my recorders and be like, oh my God, they get to have a transcript and I don't get to have it.
So you're like, but you're supposed to be kind of creeping around following the president. And are you supposed to be there at all times or only when he's saying something that's public? Like, how does that work?
Public and also semi-public.
Did you feel like sometimes you would be there and you could sense that you weren't wanted there because they didn't, or were you there to get every single word?
There were enough gatekeepers, and you learn quickly how much space to give him, and you kind of, it's almost this air in the room where you're like, okay, this is too private. I would always err on the side of not being in the room, and then if they wanted me, they would grab me. But I was sort of the human walking record. So every once in a while, they would grab me and be like, Beck, we need you up here. He's doing this interview. And President Obama would look at me and be like, I thought this was off the record. And he'd be so disappointed because he would see me and be like, oh no, now there's an official transcript. I thought this was going to be casual.
You in the book write not only about your day job in the Oval Office, but also about your personal life. And you said earlier that, there was a lot of drama, and you write like very, explicitly or openly about your love life and your sex life. So what drove you to do that? Like, why did you decide to do that alongside the day job?
I was writing this whole time. I've been writing since I was a little kid. I just basically continued to write when I got my job at the White House. And obviously the stories got a little more interesting.
Yeah.
And so when I first thought about turning this into some sort of book, I was thinking essays where I'm a fly on the wall. It's not about me. And then I got some very good advice from David Remnick.
Editor of the New Yorker.
Yeah, I got to send him some essays because I'd met him on the road traveling with President Obama. And he was kind enough to be like, you can send me some writing. And he was just sort of like, you're so strange. You make no sense in this atmosphere. You got your job on Craigslist. How are you not in this story? Like, you need to be in this story. And so basically there was one Sunday afternoon after he advised me on that I sat down and just started writing the opening scene of the book, where it's like, when you're in DC, the first question everyone asks is, what do you do? And from there, the book kind of wrote itself. And if I was going to write about my experience at the White House, I wanted it to be my full experience, in part because I don't think it had really been done before. And as a former English teacher, I thought about my younger sister and all the girls I had taught. And it was like, what do I want them to think about when they're navigating their first and second and third jobs? Because even though the White House is a really special place to work, in some ways it's like any other place where you're navigating all of these unspoken rules and these hierarchies and trying to figure it out and feeling kind of dumb a lot of the time.
Well, it's interesting because some books seem to take up the mantle of work-life balance, but only, sort of in an older demographic where it's more about how do you raise kids or how do you deal with marriage. But you're talking about like your dating life, which definitely seems a different way to approach it. Did you have any trepidation? Tell us a little bit about it so people know why.
Sure. So I started off in 2012 with a boyfriend I was certain I was going to marry. And then a lot of things happened. He was a political wonk. He went and did the Obama re-election campaign. and then realized he loved campaigns and so kept pursuing his career dreams, which I wanted to support, but was also dying because I just wanted him to stay in the same city I was in. And then I ended up falling in love with a colleague in the White House who I was traveling with all of the time. And
there's like a guessing game, by the way. I'm sure you know about like who this person is. Jason.
Yeah. And so it was complicated and
he has a pseudonym in the book.
Heart-wrenching and devastating. And when I was living it, I was so mad at myself because most people have a Jason in their past or in their present. And at the time I was so lonely because I thought I was the only one who was constantly falling for this guy who was clearly the wrong guy. And looking back, it's like, oh no, everyone has a Jason. It's just normally it happens earlier. I was the self-righteous one in college who was like, oh my gosh, guys, why are you dating these horrible men? And then it took me until I was 27 to have my heart wallballed for a couple of years.
I'm going to save that for when I'm working in the White House.
Yeah.
Why are you wasting that, doing that in college?
Something about walking on the beach in Hawaii and then running through a thunderstorm in Vietnam. It's hard to resist these guys sometimes.
So you end up staying with this job into the Trump White House a little bit. Does that mean you're not employed then by the administration, but you're employed by the institution?
Exactly. When the government had its shutdown 2013, 2014, Josh Earnest actually in the press office was looking at ways to cut down on spending. And so that he was like, oh my gosh, these stenographers come here every day. Why don't we just make them in-house instead of paying this middleman? And so they brought them in. And Peggy, my boss, had been there since Reagan. She was like, whoa, I can't lose my job in 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so Josh was great and made sure that we were in this funny little category of non-political staff, career staff. So we got to stay.
What most surprised you about what it's actually like to work in the White House?
So I really didn't love living in DC, and I would go to these happy hours and it would just be all these like greasy people who ask you, what do you do? And you end up feeling horrible about yourself. And I thought that working in the White House would sort of be a continuation of that. And instead it's this amazing group of people who come from all walks of life. I think especially in the Obama administration, a lot of those people weren't planning to ever work in the White House.
Mm-hmm.
And so they come with this diverse set of backgrounds and values and interests. And so it's really cool. It was like the best of a college experience where you're like, I get to meet people I would have never met otherwise. And we're working towards something so much bigger than ourselves. And so to get to go there every day and see what these people were doing and how hard they were working, that was in part why I felt like I had to write the book, because it was like, people don't even understand. I certainly didn't as an outsider, how much people care and how lucky we are to have these idealists going into the Obama White House.
Did it make you more idealistic?
When I first got there, sure.
It took a while for you to get cynical.
When I was there, every day that I worked in the Obama administration, it was very easy to be hopeful. You have President Obama at the helm, showing us letters being like, this is who we're working for, and it's for a farmer in Iowa. It's really cool. And you would get to meet people on the road who were like, President Obama saved my life, or my baby daughter would be dead right now if it weren't for President Obama. So every day it was easy to be hopeful. And obviously it's just hard looking back now and looking forward to be quite as idealistic.
So Trump gets elected. What happens to your job and that of the other 4 White House stenographers? You obviously left. When did you leave?
I left in March, but so I stayed for 2 months, and, we showed up, we typed up the transcript on Inauguration Day, which was wild to say the least of it.
Yeah. What was that like?
It was devastating. I just cried the whole time I was typing up the transcript because it was so crazy. The juxtaposition of typing up an Obama transcript and then this kind of like fire and fury craziness that was that speech. It was just a nightmare. And
so that was your job. You were the person that typed up that inaugural speech.
And it was crazy because all of my friends from the Obama White House actually went to the tarmac at Joint Andrews to say farewell to the president before he got on Marine One for the last time. And I had to stay and type up this transcript. So I kept getting all these texts being like, hey, do you need a ride? Are you good? Like, are you coming? And I was like, I have to stay and type this transcript.
After that day, what is it like then working in the White House?
I went to the White House the first Sunday after inauguration, which was when it was still the big debate was the crowd size. And Sean Spicer came out and made some statement about how it was true that it was this huge crowd. And I went in to see and transcribe the senior staff getting sworn in. And it was this heartbreaking moment of I walk into the West Wing and the offices where my friends had been working the whole time I was there are suddenly empty. And there's a ton of yelling going on. And every once in a while, someone walks by on stilettos that are just not great for working.
Mm-hmm.
And they're frantic and there's a sense of chaos. And they had gone out of their way to not cooperate or coordinate with the Obama administration during the transition. So they were really kind of running around with their heads cut off. And it was just like, what are we in for?
And you met President Trump on Air Force One.
I encountered President Trump on Air Force
Tell
One.
us about that.
I flew to Mar-a-Lago once and I got on the plane. And luckily, Air Force One, it's an active duty military plane. And so the flight attendants remained the same. And they had also become like family. They had taken care of me when I was really sick, flying back from Africa. And so Chrissy, one of the flight attendants, is like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "I'm not okay." And she was like, "Okay, I'm going to bring you an orange juice."
Mm-hmm.
And Fox News is blasting. And it's this whole set of DC creatures, the likes of which I have never encountered. None of them even have a background in politics. And they're just kind of on this crazy field trip on Air Force One. It's a bunch of kids running around. I went into the staff office and there's some tiny, scrawny intern who's just like ruffling all of the papers, all of the official Air Force One papers. And I'm getting really upset because the military is an organized group. And I'm like, oh my God, they're going to be so mad. He's just like messing up all of the perfect stacks of papers.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said, "Can I help you with something?" And I was so mad at this intern. I was like, "Why are you even on the plane?" And he turns around and it's actually Jared Kushner.
Oh.
And I was like, "Okay, all right, just mess it all up." And then I went back to my seat and there was a gaggle that no one told me about. They did not understand the role of the stenographer. I'm there to protect the president and what he says, but they never told me what was going on. So I'm sitting in my seat. The military aide is like, "Hey, I'm sorry to tell you, they just gaggled." And the military aide has other jobs to do. And yet he's the only one to be like, "You just missed a gaggle, so you got to get the transcript somehow."
Okay, a gaggle?
A gaggle is an informal press briefing on the plane with the 13 reporters and photojournalists who travel with the president. Anyway, so then I'm standing in my seat and President Trump walks by. And then my seat is kind of off to the side. I always kind of describe it as a cul-de-sac seat where you don't have to come over unless you want to come over.
Mm-hmm.
But he somehow gets lost on the plane. He's supposed to be giving Melania a tour. It's her first time on the plane. And he comes over to my seat. So I jump up. Muscle memory. It's the president of the United States. You show respect. So I jump up and then I take a step back. I had learned from working with President Obama, like give the most powerful man as much personal space as you can because he's just surrounded by people all the time. But when I took a step back, Trump actually took a step forward into my personal space, which was upsetting, but not surprising because we already knew who he was. And I actually looked over his shoulder at Melania and she just looked at the ground. And he said, "Hello." And I said, "Hi, sir." And he goes, "Hello." And I'm like, are we just on Teletubbies right now? Are we just going to do this all afternoon?
Mm-hmm.
And luckily someone grabbed him and was like, "Sir, you're trying to go talk to the press. It's actually this way." So I don't know how he got lost because it's a big plane, but it has the same architecture as any plane where there's one main aisle.
Mm-hmm.
But that's Trump for you.
So how different was it working as a stenographer than in the Trump White House?
It could not have been more different. And part of it, if you want to, give them the benefit of the doubt, is it was a new administration. I was there during a transition. That said, the energy seemed to be going into the facade and the presentation much more than any sort of substance. So I covered the Bill O'Reilly interview, and I just remember I go down to cover this interview and Hope Hicks comes and grabs Bill O'Reilly and they disappear for an hour. And he goes and talks to Trump in the Oval.
Mm-hmm.
And they're gone for an hour. We're all sitting there because it was a scheduled interview. It's supposed to be like 20 minutes. And then finally they come down and that's the interview where Trump was like, "Well, we all have blood on our hands."
Mm-hmm.
And I just remember thinking, this is so crazy because President Obama worked really hard to be transparent with the press, but also was like, that's not why I'm here. I'm not working to communicate with the press all the time. I'm working here to work on behalf of the American people. So it blew my mind that Trump had just spent an hour and a half with Bill O'Reilly when it was like, there are so many other things you could be doing right now.
So did you know that you were going to leave after he was elected, or did you intend to stay on?
The silver lining, and I'm sorry to say, just personally, I can't give a general silver lining of Trump winning, is that it was the ultimate incentive to get myself out of the White House and to take myself seriously as a writer. It was sort of a now or never moment. So when he won, I was like, okay, this is when I have to do it. I mean, if Trump can be president, I can certainly be a writer. And so that was when I started pursuing the writing and pursuing the book. And so I was trying to get out of there as quickly as possible. If Hillary had won, I would probably still be a stenographer right now, observing her up close, seeing the differences. But when Trump won, it was like, I can't stay here, so let's do this. And so as soon as Penguin Random House was like, all right, we're good, we can do this together, I was like, bye-bye. And my agent actually called me while I was in the middle of typing a Sean Spicer briefing. And she was like, I think you just typed your last briefing.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right. The book is From the Corner of the Oval. It's a memoir by Beck Dorey-Stein. And everyone here who hasn't read it is very eager to. So thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Caroline Weber joins us now. She's a professor of French and comparative literature at Barnard and at Columbia, and her new book is called Proust, Duchess: How Three Celebrated Women Captured the Imagination of Fin-De-Siècle Paris. Caroline, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, let's start with the title of this book for those who have not read their Proust or not read their Proust lately. Who was Proust's Duchess?
So Proust's Duchess in his novel In Search of Lost Time was this sort of reigning goddess of aristocratic society in Paris at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. And in the novel, it's one character who's supremely elegant, kind of chilly and distant, supposedly has beautiful artistic taste, beautiful fashion taste. And the narrator, who's bourgeois and whose name is Marcel, kind of admires her from afar and then gradually over the course of several thousand pages gets to know her. And in real life, Proust, who was bourgeois and fascinated with the aristocracy, based this character on three different women whose collective biography I've now told in this book.
And how do we know he based it on them?
He said it in a number of his letters, even though he was famously cagey about acknowledging real-life models for his characters. But it wasn't unique to the Duchess either. Most of the characters in his book, at least the main characters, had a number of different kind of real-life inspirations in turn-of-the-century Paris. And so in addition to kind of Proust's cagey acknowledgments in various private writings and letters, there's also just the fact that each of the three women had very specific and recognizable character traits that all wound up being applied to this character of the Duchess de Guermantes. So to contemporaries, they all kind of recognized these three women in Proust's fictional character.
All right, let's talk about who the three women are. And I'm not going to go through their long and elaborate titles, but their names were Geneviève Alavie Bizet-Strauss, Laure de Sade, and Elisabeth Comtesse Greffule. Let's start with Geneviève. Who was she?
So Geneviève is in some ways the least expected person on whom Proust might have thought to base an aristocratic character, because like him, she was actually from the Jewish haute bourgeoisie in Paris. And typically high society at that time was more or less limited to aristocrats. But she became kind of an honorary member of aristocratic society because she was very witty, she was very glamorous, and in particular, she came from a world that was fascinating to the aristocracy, and it was one that in some ways was as hard to get into as the nobility was, and that was sort of the world of artistic celebrity. Her father was considered one of the greatest composers of the 19th century, Fromental Alévi. He's largely forgotten today. But his masterpiece, La Juive, or The Jewess, was the most performed opera in Europe throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. And Proust often quotes from this opera. There's a famous aria called Rachel, Win of the Lord, and Proust cites it kind of jokingly throughout the Recherche, throughout In Search of Lost Time, as a nod to Geneviève. So the aristocracy were sort of fascinated with her artistic background. She became even more famous in the kind of art and music worlds because she married her father's most promising student, whose name was Georges Bizet, who at the time was totally obscure, and whose greatest opera, Carmen, premiered to very little critical acclaim and a few months before he died. And after he died, all of a sudden, Carmen, which had flopped at its premiere, became sort of posthumously recognized as this incredible work of opera. And Geneviève essentially became famous sort of posing around Paris as the widow Bizet, even though she'd been secretly carrying on an affair with one of Bizet's best friends when he died, while he was writing Carmen. And when he died, she actually posed for 8 years in widow's weeds to kind of remind the public all the time that she had been bereaved of this great French genius. And that made her incredibly interesting and kind of appealing to the aristocracy.
What did fame look like during that period in Paris?
Fame looked like basically a lot what it looks like today, with slightly different media in play. There was an incredible explosion of popular newspaper, mass-produced newspapers at the turn of the 19th century. And there was a whole subgenre or cottage industry known as the presse mondaine, the society press, and the number of daily, weekly, and monthly publications that sort of cataloged the high times of the high nobility was an incredibly popular genre at that time, and really read widely throughout the French public, throughout the literate French public. And that was the way that somebody like Proust, who was on the outside looking in to noble society, first started learning about these people. And with Geneviève, with artistic celebrities, it basically worked the same way. Both art world celebrities and aristocratic grand seigneur and grande dame, anything they did was more or less front page news in these kind of early versions of the tabloid press. So Geneviève was very, very well known from the press. Another way of kind of boosting one's celebrity at that time was posing for portraits and photographs. And she posed for a famous portrait in her widow's weeds in 1878, kind of mourning the great genius Bizet. And that painting essentially captured the imagination of an entire generation of writers and artists before Proust. Guy de Maupassant, who was besotted with Geneviève, based much of a whole novel, one of the last novels he wrote before his early death, on that portrait. So posing for painting and photography was another big way to get oneself known by the press, kind of an early version of Instagram today.
And so did a woman like Geneviève and the other women you portray in the book, did they seek celebrity? Because we think of the aristocracy as sort of removed and generally trying to stay out of the spotlight, perhaps. But
yeah, no, that's such a good point to make. And it's one that I try to make a bit in my book, to say that essentially these women were at a watershed moment in history when traditionally just being born into patrician society would have sufficed to make one prominent and to give one a certain degree of cultural and social authority. And then a few generations later, kind of birth and pedigree wouldn't really matter so much at all. But these women were sort of ahead of their time in the sense that even as they wanted to belong to and stay in aristocratic society, so Geneviève kind of gets herself adopted by that class. The other two women I wrote about were born and married into that class. On the one hand, they recognize the sort of noble belief that you want to not be overly publicized, you want to not be vulgar and overly accessible to kind of the general populace, which the aristocrats at the time referred to as the losers' club. But on the other hand, these women recognized that there was this incredibly potent new force in French public life, which was the press. And so, yes, all three of these women were very modern in the way that they actively courted the media and actively sought celebrity. And it made them mavericks within their class, but in fact, they were the avatars of a model of celebrity that we recognize very much and that's still very much in place today.
So Geneviève was born into a famous artistic family, married a musician who went on to great fame, I guess posthumously.
Sadly.
But what distinguished her?
Well, one of the great features that supposedly distinguished her, and it's really hard to convey, especially in English, but really even writing in French in the 21st century, because it was so specific to the time and place, and that was her sense of humor. One of the characteristics that Proust gives to the Duchess de Guermantes in his novel, and it's a very strange way of describing it, but he repeatedly gives her the characteristic of what he calls Meillac and Halévy wit. And Meillac and Halévy were the librettists for Carmen. They were also Ludovic Halévy was Geneviève's first cousin and basically kind of the brother that she never had. And his writing partner Meillac were two of the most popular dramatists of 19th century Paris, as well as being librettists. And they coined this very frothy, ironic brand of Parisian wit that was on display in all of their plays and operas and things, and light operas. They also wrote a lot for Offenbach and other kind of light operatic composers. But anyway, this kind of frothy, ironic sensibility was one that Geneviève apparently epitomized herself. So even though she was associated with this man who was much more famous than she was in the art world, Ludovic Halévy, she actually was recognized by her contemporaries as the great living model of Meilhac and Halévy wit. And it's a weird quality to ascribe to a woman from the high aristocracy because it's kind of a lowbrow boulevard theater, raucous and popularly appealing mode of wit. And it depends a lot on word plays that are awfully hard to translate from French into English. But there are a few that translate fairly well. And one of my favorite ones, after she was widowed for 11 years post the death of Bizet, she remarried, kind of almost against her better judgment, a very rich, very assiduous admirer of hers who was rumored to be an illegitimate son of Baron James de Rothschild. His name was Emile Strauss. And none of her friends could stand Strauss. She probably couldn't really stand Strauss based on the letters that I read. But the joke that she liked to say was when people asked her why on earth she married him, she would shrug and say, it was the only way I could get rid of him. And that's sort of a version of Meilhac and Halévy wit. And those kind of witticisms are the ones that the Duchess de Guermantes makes throughout Proust's novel. Many of them are taken directly from Geneviève.
Well, that one definitely translates. All right. Yeah. I want to talk about their terrible marriages in a bit, but let's talk first a little bit about Elisabeth Comtesse Greffule, who I guess was known mostly for her great beauty and fashion sense.
Yeah. And she was really known as, and this is another characteristic that Proust gives the Duchess de Guermantes in the novel, the most beautiful and the most cheated on woman in Paris. She was married off by
back to the bad marriage.
Yeah, back to the bad marriage. I know it's hard to get away from, but so she, the bad marriage is relevant here because she married this guy who was incredibly rich, was considered very handsome, was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in the French aristocracy. He married her because she came from an older and grander noble family than he did. His title was only 70 years old, which was pretty nouveau. But her husband, Henry Greffule, really had a confirmed taste for blue-eyed blondes, and Elizabeth had dark hair and dark eyes, and her husband made it very clear to her from the beginning of their marriage that he didn't find her that attractive. And so she kind of compensated for this narcissistic wound by turning herself almost by force of will into this great beauty. And one of the really fun things about doing research for the book is that she left behind about 200 and maybe 20 boxes of unpublished papers that her family let me use. And many, many of those boxes were just filled with love letters, anonymous fan letters, love letters from her husband's friends, love letters from her husband's relatives. Everybody seemed to be chasing the Comtesse Greffule except for her husband. So it was a kind of a sad position that she was in. And she writes in a lot of her own unpublished diaries and letters about how despairing she is to have a husband who keeps rejecting her. But she would always find solace in, as she wrote quite explicitly, the sort of adoration or the anonymous caress of her admirers throughout the Parisian public.
Where are those boxes kept, and where is that family today? Like, where is an aristocratic family of 19th century Paris now in 21st century France?
Yeah, it's really, it depends on the family. But in this case, those private papers of Elizabeth's were for a long time kept in her family of origins castle in Belgium, the Château de Chimay. They eventually turned them over to the Archives Nationales in Paris, but in a section of the Archives Nationales called the private archives. And so you require, in order to get to consult those papers, you have to get the written permission of the head of the family, who was the Duc de Gramont, who was actually based in Houston, Texas. But most of the rest of Elizabeth's descendants are pretty much based in Paris and around France. A lot of them were incredibly helpful and kind to me, and some of them are reading the book now in English, and I'm hoping that they'll like what I wrote. And some of them are in Belgium and have married into aristocratic families. So there's been a real effort among certain branches of her family tree really to stay intermarried within the nobility. But then there are other people like the head of her descendants' family, the Duc de Gramont, who married an American woman in Houston, lived in Texas, recently, unfortunately, died in Texas. So there's kind of a diaspora of the French nobility outside of Paris, but most of the people I talk to really are still based in Paris and are still holding on to their ancestral properties in the provinces.
Their titles and everything.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the third woman, Laure de Sade, who we can tell was born into an interesting family.
Yeah, and she's really kind of my favorite character, I think, of the three of them, because she was the boldest and the most courageous in many ways in terms of forging a particular identity for herself. Her great-grandfather was the infamous Marquis de Sade, the most notorious high literary pornographer in French cultural history. And in the late 19th century, when Laure was a young woman on the marriage market within the nobility in France, that was a huge deficiency to have. It was a huge black mark on the family to be descended from this man who, although very well born, was incredibly poorly behaved.
Right.
And we tend to forget, or at least I tended to forget until immersing myself in this period, that the Third Republic in France, which is the regime that these women all lived under,
was 1870.
Kind of beginning 1870, and it goes all the way up until World War II. But the kind of period, the last several decades of the 19th century, correspond to the Victorian age in England. And there is a real Victorian kind of primness and prudishness about the French aristocracy at this time. And Laure decided that if she couldn't beat her reputation, she would actually make the most of it. And so instead of being embarrassed by and apologizing for this sort of infamous branch of her family tree, she owned it. And at a time when French women were never supposed to say anything even remotely controversial or vulgar. She loved cursing. She would refer to his X-rated oeuvre in conversation. She was known, even when she died in 1936, as the first woman in Parisian society ever heard to say merde. And that was considered a huge deal. So
we won't translate that on this PJ
or
podcast.
Maybe you'll bleep it. But anyway, but it was a big deal, the sort of the persona she cultivated of somebody who was going to break all the rules. She was going to be tough talking. She smoked like a chimney, which was also not considered very ladylike in her class. She rode and shot. She was kind of a tomboy. She loved hunting. She was the first woman in Parisian society also to kind of start dressing in little tailored androgynous wool suits that she had modeled on the suits of her various lovers from great English tailors in Paris. So she was really a sort of a rebel countess in many ways, and that very much appealed to Proust, somebody who was in the nobility, accepted by the nobility, but sort of at the margins of socially acceptable behavior all the time, and somebody who was like Geneviève Strauss, meant to be incredibly witty and irreverent in a way that made going to her salon incredibly engaging for aristocrats who were used to sort of staid, often very ritualized and formal conversation.
And do we have evidence of that wit and her sort of way of speaking? Like, did she keep diaries? Do we have her letters?
She was the most circumspect of my three ladies in terms of leaving a paper trail. One example of her wit is she famously said that all letters were either compromising or boring, and for both reasons, you should try to avoid writing letters as much as possible. But it was a letter writing period. It was how you communicated. The telephone was coming into vogue at that time, or coming into use at that time, and I'm imagining that Laure made good use of the telephone. But yeah, there are plenty of letters of hers that have survived in different archives of different members of her salon who were mostly from the high aristocracy, but she befriended some writers as well. And yeah, the wit does come through in a lot of her letters, just this very sort of irreverent, familiar kind of badinage that she was really known for. And she also was meant to have a very kind of cultivated, deliberate, rustic or provincial accent, kind of modeled on the peasantry that had worked on her family's estates when she was growing up. And so there's kind of a peasant drawl that she has that's also very incongruous within the high nobility, and that peasant drawl is another characteristic that the Duchess de Guermantes and Proust winds up having, and that was taken really directly from Laure de Chavigny.
So do these three women know each other?
Yeah, they did, and Laure and Geneviève were friends, in fact, but all three of them really preferred being the only woman in the room. None of them was what we would have called a girl's girl. They all really lived for the admiration and adulation of their little coteries of male admirers. So the amount of kind of friendship, the deep friendship that was really possible between them was probably limited. Although I did find here at the Morgan Library in New York, and I need to write more about this in the sequel to this book because there are many more decades of these women's lives that I have to cover in another version. Laure was named as the only woman in Geneviève's handwritten will that's here in the Morgan Library, other than Geneviève's female servants. And interestingly, Geneviève left Laure a little piece of furniture that was supposedly filled with Geneviève's letters. And I believe that probably it was because Geneviève trusted Laure with her legacy. But
to know which ones were boring and which ones were
compromising.
Yeah.
Exactly. And but sadly, Genevieve's husband, the one that she married in order to get rid of him, was a very, very jealous man. And he was also a lawyer and her executor of her estate. And so the Morgan Library has her handwritten will where she says very clearly that she wants this little piece of furniture with the letters in it to go to Laure de Chevigné. And then the copy of the will that was written up by her husband gets rid of the reference to Laure. And so I think he never gave Laure the letters, and those have probably been destroyed or lost. So yeah, one last gesture of control by the unloved husband, but it attests to some kind of friendship between those two women at least.
The idea of a literary or artistic salon is so enticing. We romanticize it. We think about, Midnight in Paris, the Woody Allen movie, or, but what actually happened at these salons? Like, what did it look like? Was it a party? What was it?
Yeah, it is a strange thing. And you're right. We do romanticize it. And what I concluded from my research is that actually, for the most part, going to these salons was fairly boring. It was very formal.
Good.
So yeah, good. So
One
we're not
last
really
thing
missing
to
anything.
feel bad about having missed.
No, that's exactly right. That it was very for the most part. The salon was an aristocratic institution, and it dated back to the days of Louis XIV in the 17th century, when conversation at court was so hamstrung by propriety and etiquette that aristocrats started meeting in the salons of especially their mansions in Paris, in order to kind of get away from all of the ceremony and all of the rigidity of kind of court protocol. But that institution or that practice kind of quickly ossified into a fairly ritualized event itself. And people would come in, and the women were wearing full-length, corseted, kind of what would look to us today like ball gowns, but they were, daytime dresses, white gloves. Men would come in full-on kind of morning coats and top hats, even in the middle of summer, also wearing gloves. There was a ritual where the men would take off their hats when entering and put them on crown first on the ground. And there's a beautiful movie, an adaptation of Proust's Time Regained, that showed here recently at Lincoln Center. And there's a beautiful shot that shows just a whole salon filled with top hats that are placed on the ground to kind of crown down. But in fact, people would just sort of make small talk for a few hours. Generally, these were afternoon events, like 2 to 4
so
or
we get
4
an
to 6.
invitation,
Maybe you'd get an invitation at the beginning to somebody's at home. But essentially, I think one of the reasons these salons became kind of boring is that the really elite ones were closed salons. And so once you kind of had your clique of friends, they would come to your salon week after week, month after month, year after year, and you would wind up having the same conversation with the same people for often decades on end. And so part of the appeal, I think, of especially Geneviève and Laure, because they were considered witty, was that they kept things a little bit livelier in their salon by being witty and by being irreverent. But the salon really, even though it had started out as sort of an antidote to the formality that the aristocracy had to live with at the court, really turned into another dull ritual. And so, I don't think we missed a lot. And in fact, there was also sort of an unwritten rule for the aristocracy that it was bad manners to talk too much about ideas or talk too much about art or seem too clever in a salon, because a lot of the members of the aristocracy who were just invited to the salon because of their title weren't necessarily that bright or that well educated. And so you wouldn't, as a hostess, want to make people ill at ease by talking about a book that people hadn't read or that they didn't understand. So a lot of the time, even when artists were invited into these salons, Proust was really shocked to discover at Genevieve's that this kind of queen of Bohemia and queen of the Parisian art world assiduously avoided artistic and cultural topics, even though she would often have many of the most famous painters and writers and musicians of the day gathered there. They would all have to talk about the weather. And that's another thing that Proust kind of parodies in his novel, in the Duchess de Guermantes' Salon, where the narrator is meeting for the first time a poet whom he worships, who's a regular member of this salon. And he notices that the Duchess insists just on talking about the quality of the eggs that she's serving for dinner instead of the poet's poetry, which is ostensibly why he's there.
But who was at these salons? Like, who would go to Genevieve's salon?
The makeup of the salon was really different depending on the hostess or the salonière. And so another aspect of Genevieve's appeal within the nobility was the fact that she actually mixed up members of the aristocracy with famous artists, writers, and painters who were kind of intriguing curiosities for the members of the nobility to meet. Elizabeth Greffule really considered herself an intellectual and did have a kind of an unusually cultured background. Her mother had trained as a concert pianist. Elizabeth herself was very musical. And so she also sort of developed a salon that was sort of a mixture of famous artists and musicians and even some scientists. She supported the work of the Curies and Louis Pasteur and occasionally had them invited to her salon. And she would combine them with members of the nobility. Laure de Sade, despite her literary antecedents as a descendant of the Marquis de Sade, really preferred to keep her salon restricted to noblemen, and specifically noblemen who were in love with her, and most of whom were about 20 years older than she. So I think her salon was probably the least exciting in terms of the names on the list. We recognize from Elizabeth that she had, Pasteur, or she had Gounod, or she had Proust eventually from time to time, although she never particularly appreciated or liked Proust. And then Genevieve's was sort of the salon that would sound the most exciting to us today, because we know that Edgar Degas went there. We know that Massenet went. We know that Gustave Moreau went. Maupassant went. And yet the conversation at those salons was, according to Proust, surprisingly boring.
I loved the line from Elizabeth that she remembered him as a displeasing little man who was forever skulking about in doorways.
Oh, so harsh. Yeah, so harsh. And so true. I mean, that really is how she regarded him till the bitter end.
So there's a line in our review that says that all three women married for money and status and lived unhappily with neurasthenic mothers, chilly in-laws, unfaithful husbands, disappointing children, loneliness, depression, and ennui.
Yes.
Were these salons their way of escaping all of that?
I think so. And I loved that line. I almost felt like that line pretty much sums up the entire book. And I wish I could have written it in a much more condensed
Your book is slightly
fashion.
longer.
Yeah, my book is slightly longer. But no, it's a brilliant line, and it's really true. And yeah, I think the salons and kind of more generally this pursuit of a certain new kind of celebrity that they really helped to invent, those were their avenues to some kind of meaning or self-worth when they were born and married into these families and into a society where there was very little role for them otherwise. One of the things that I try to emphasize in the book, and that really came as a surprise to me in researching this period, was that women had the legal status of minors in this society. They weren't allowed to vote. They weren't allowed in the universities. They weren't basically allowed to have jobs. If they had any money, brought any money into their marriages, they didn't really have access to it without their husband's permission. So there was very little opportunity for these women to kind of have a meaningful life, and especially if they were unhappily married, if their husbands cheated on them, if their children were disappointing, if their in-laws, whom they had to see every day, all the time. The aristocracy tended to live and still tends to live kind of in family houses. So if they were in kind of a miserable situation domestically, there wasn't a lot else for them to do. And my three women were really, in many ways, very impressive to me because they were creative in trying to find some satisfaction in their lives, however limited. I mean, ultimately being a salonière or being a celebrity doesn't seem like that validating or thrilling a pursuit, but for them, it was about as good as it got.
Before writing about this period, your previous two books were about Revolutionary War era France.
That's right.
What moved you to say, the Duchess de Guermantes, who was she? What inspired her? And to write a book about this period?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think the similarity between Revolutionary France and this period, which was one that really fascinated me and I wanted to learn more about, was this idea of kind of a particular privileged social and political order in crisis. And so, in the revolution, the nobility, basically gets stripped of all of its titles and its castles. And then later it manages to get some of that back in the early to mid 19th century. But by the end of the 19th century, the nobility is essentially living through another French Revolution. The Third Republic is founded in 1870. One of the things the Republican government, meaning the democratic government of France does is they again strip the nobles of not their titles. The nobility were allowed to still use their titles as courtesy titles, but basically strip the nobility of their political and economic privileges. And so the nobility is really struggling to find a new role for itself in this kind of modern era. And so the kind of the link between the revolution and this sort of aristocracy in crisis was very interesting to me. But then the other draw was really that I love Proust. And so, he's such a good writer, and he himself is so deeply immersed in and steeped in the literature of the Ancien Régime. One of his favorite writers, who's also one of my favorite writers from the 18th century, which was the period in which I was trained, is the Duc de Saint-Simon, who wrote these really persnickety and hilarious memoirs of life at Versailles. And you can see in a lot of Proust that he's pastiching the Duc de Saint-Simon in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And so Proust, for me, is kind of strangely a kind of hinge point between the Ancien Régime and modern France. And that was really, for me, the draw beyond the fact just that there's no one who's more fun to read than Proust. He's hilarious. He's beautiful. He's heartbreaking. And I just decided that I wanted to spend a few years in the company of the best writer I could think of. So that was really, for me, one of the great delights of this project.
All right, Caroline, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Caroline Weber's new book is called Proust's Duchess, How Three Celebrated Women Captured the Imagination of Fin-De-Siècle Paris. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
All right, you've promised us good news.
Deliver. I do. I know I've been a downer these recent weeks, so I thought we might look at what is selling. And not surprisingly, political books are still incredibly popular, both with publishers and with readers. We had another interesting acquisition this week by HarperCollins. They bought H.R. McMaster's book, Battlegrounds, which is looking at his 34-year career in the Army, including his recent 13-month tenure as National Security Advisor for the Trump administration, which is, I think, what most people will be interested in. And what's interesting to me is this appetite for political fare has extended now to the fiction list. It's not just nonfiction. For the past 5 weeks, Bill Clinton and James Patterson's novel, The President is Missing, has been #1 on our list. And this week, another political novel came out of a very different type. It's called Hope Never Dies, and it is a crime fiction kind of cop buddy comedy starring Barack Obama and Joe Biden as amateur sleuths who have teamed up to solve a mysterious death. And it's extremely funny. It's by Andrew Schaefer, and it's coming out from Quirk Books. And it's sort of perfect because he captures their public personas very accurately. Barack Obama is the Sherlock Holmes to kind of Biden's bumbling, impulsive Watson, and Obama's always playing it cool and being very rational when they get into mischief and get in over their heads. But of course, it is a little bit over the top at times. There's a scene where Obama bursts into a biker gang clubhouse to rescue Biden and with a sawed-off shotgun. So I spoke to Andrew Schaefer about writing this book, and he admitted there were some parts that weren't realistic, but he said, don't you want to see him do that? I just had to admit it was pretty great.
So he's done a number of these kind of spoofs, right? Are they always political?
They're not always political. He wrote, you might know him for his work, 50 Shames of Earl Grey, which is a 50 Shades of Grey parody. He wrote an eerily prophetic satire called The Day of the Donald Trump Trumps America, which came out 6 months before the 2016 election and predicted Trump's win. It includes a scene where Vladimir Putin fights a panda bear. But you know what's interesting?
That didn't happen?
I'm sure it did. What's interesting about Hope Never Dies, which is the first in a series of Obama-Biden crime novels, is that it is not quite a parody. I mean, there's very funny parts, but it works at the level of a mystery. And he and his publisher were both really adamant that they didn't want it to be kind of a spoofy satire. Mm-hmm. So they wanted it to kind of be about their friendship, the Obama-Biden bromance, and they wanted it to work kind of mechanically at the level of a crime novel. And it does that. I mean, there's actually surprisingly sincere moments where they're kind of patching up their friendship, which has frayed ever since Obama started pursuing extreme sporting activities with his celebrity friends like Bradley Cooper and others, which in this book Biden is furious about. So he said he was trying to kind of play it somewhat straight and somewhat funny.
Any word on what Obama or Biden think of this book?
You know, it's funny. I asked the author that, and he said he went to an event on Biden's book tour when his memoir came out. He went to an event in December to meet him and was planning on introducing himself and saying, hey, I'm writing this crime novel and you and Obama are in it. But when he got up to meet Biden, he was behind a man who had a very touching story about how his son was killed in combat, and he gave Biden this medal that his son had earned. And the author, Andrew Schaefer, was wearing this kind of silly T-shirt of a penguin eating an ice cream cone. And so he suddenly felt really ridiculous, and he couldn't bring himself to bring up the novel. But he did say that Biden put him at ease and said, hey, ice cream, that's my favorite. So he managed to have a pleasant encounter with him, but has not heard word on whether Obama and Biden actually like it. But I think his publisher is anticipating that, this book will appeal not just to crime fiction fans, but possibly to disaffected Democrats who wish that Obama and Biden would come out of retirement and emerge as, action heroes.
All right, Alexander, I'm not sure if this totally qualifies as positive Alexander, but we'll take it.
It was the best I could do this week.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now, my colleagues Greg Coles, John Williams, and Lauren Christensen to talk about what we're reading. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
All right, let's not start with Greg or me, since who wants to start with Joyce or a 900-page history of the English? John, what are you reading?
In May, we asked the daily book critics at the Times and a couple of other people here, including myself, what they were going to read this summer. And so I put this in print and I felt an obligation. I'm probably the only person who cares, but I thought now that I've said it and that it's in the paper, I should do it, which is that I wanted to read a bunch of Japanese literature because I just haven't done it. And I became interested in it through this conversation I read online between David Mitchell and David Peace, the two British writers. And they were talking about all of their favorite books in the Japanese canon. And I found it really interesting. So I bought, 7 to 10 of them because I'm wasteful. And I put them in a stack and now I'm starting. So this is the first one I'm reading and it's called Kokoro, Kokoro, by Natsumi Soseki, who died in 1916. This was his last novel. And he's apparently one of Murakami's favorite writers. He was on a yen banknote for a while, for 16 or 17 years at the end of the 20th century.
That must be sad when you fall off a banknote.
I know, 16 to 17 years doesn't seem like that long a run, actually.
I mean, yeah.
How long have you been on a banknote?
Well, and he was put on it, I guess, maybe 80 years after he died. So it's, he doesn't feel bad about it, at least. And this is the story of a young man in Tokyo who has an elder mentor who he calls sensei and refers to him that way in the book. And it's told in 3 sections. It starts with his relationship with this older man when the narrator is a student and their friendship, which is a little mysterious but tender. And then the young man goes back home to take care of his father who's dying, to help take care of his father who's dying. And there's a short section with him and his parents back home. And then the last section, which I'm in now, is a letter that the mentor wrote to the young man to kind of explain his past, which he had kind of vaguely hinted at when he was younger. It's fantastic. It has that kind of, even though I haven't read a lot of Japanese literature, I've watched more films and I really love the movies of Ozu. And it has that kind of simplicity, but the emotional accumulation of feeling. I find myself getting very moved as things intersect and as you learn more about the characters and they disclose things in this sort of very soft way. You learn things very tangentially and I'm loving it. So as a kickoff to this project of mine, I feel like it's setting a high bar. So I'll finish that in the next day or two and then start another.
So you're going to go through all of them?
Well, I might read another by him now because this is so good, but I do have several authors lined up.
Did you read Convenience Store Woman?
No, that's a new novel, but a new short novel by a Japanese woman. And I should, but this is the first.
I find those like what I'm going to read this summer lists, it's so much pressure. And the pressure, of course, is, I think, totally self-inflicted because it's not like, come Labor Day, we're going to check back with everyone and be like, did you do it? But I remember when, I think I may have confessed this before, but the first year I started at the Book Review, I was the part-time children's books editor. And so when we were asked by someone on the desk, I think
the yearly ritual
predecessor, yes, what are you going to read this summer? I thought, I'm not going to put down like 400 picture books, which is like also what I'm going to really read this summer, but instead going to show that I actually really do read real books. So I set out this very ambitious list of something like 12, long works of fiction and nonfiction. And then, we didn't see it. I didn't see what everyone else said until it went online. And then I saw like most other reasonable people around the desk had, written 1 or 2 books. And I just looked like a total jerk. But I nonetheless felt that I had to read every single one, before Labor Day.
Yeah, I never get through these lists. But I think
we're going to check on you, John, at the end of the summer.
I think it was the fact that I did buy this pile of books. It made me feel especially like it's going to be really ridiculous if I don't start doing this.
I'm curious, John, you talk about reading back into the Japanese canon, but I assume you have read some contemporary, like Murakami.
I've never read Murakami.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh.
So
the only Murakami I've read is his nonfiction, the book about the sarin gas
right.
attacks.
And he also did a nonfiction one on running.
Right.
Yeah.
I do not run, and so I did not read. Have you read all of Murakami?
I've not read all of Murakami. He's very prolific, but I've read short stories. I read Kafka on the Shore. I read The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle.
That seems to be the one that's most frequently recommended.
The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle is really amazing. Yeah,
that's the one. That's the one I've had on my shelf for about 15 years and I've never read.
I feel like
I've had it too,
accessible.
and I bought it.
I loved Kafka on the Shore too, and it's the first Murakami I read because he was somebody who always kind of was in the background for me, somebody that people talked about, and then that book landed right at a time that I was kind of ripe and ready to read him, and so I read that, and then I went back and read the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle.
He's a big new one coming out this fall. He's not just prolific, but he writes big books, so it's intimidating.
And some small books. I read one called like After Midnight or something. There was like a little insomniac, woman sitting in an all-night diner listening to jazz.
Speaking of big intimidating books, Greg.
So I am still, I would call this my summer project, except that I started it in February, and Pamela already gave the spoiler for people who haven't been listening to the podcast anyway for 6 months. I'm still reading Ulysses.
I'm calling it your 2018 and 2019 project.
I'm now 271 pages into Ulysses. The section I'm reading right now is a lot of fun, which I have not said about a lot of Ulysses yet. It's fun for a bunch of reasons. I mentioned last time I was on the podcast that I'm reading the Odyssey alongside Ulysses as kind of a, for the conversation between the two. And when I started that, I was not finding the conversation. I thought, where is all the concurrence that's supposed to be happening? But the section of Ulysses that I'm reading right now, and I don't know if it's because it's more overt than the rest of Ulysses, or if it's because I'm finally attuned to it because of this kind of parallel reading. It is so unmistakably the sirens section of the Odyssey, and it's a couple of barmaids or bar proprietors. I mean, there's singing, there's direct references to them as mermaids, and so it's and Bloom on the rocks, and so there's this whole siren thing going on. And it's also fun because the whole point of the Sirens story is the kind of tension and battle of the sexes and sex and desire, which is always fun to read about. And so this section opens with these barmaids knowing that Bloom has been watching them, and they're kind of making fun of him as, he's just this old horn dog. And that is Bloom's character throughout. He's very neurotic about sex, and every woman that he sees, he just kind of thinks, do I have a chance with her? And he ogles everyone. And so in this part about the barmaids, it feels very of the moment and the kind of Me Too and the male gaze that women are subjected to. But at the same time that they're making fun of him and laughing uproariously about all this, they have their eye on Buck Mulligan and Daedalus and saying, these comely lads. And so there's this, and they like being observed and ogled, even as they're making fun of Bloom for ogling them. So it's this whole kind of very nuanced and fraught, and human and updating of the Sirens story that makes it feel very relevant and contemporary.
I think this scene is going to put you, I think this is going to propel you further into the book. This is the first time you felt like very energetic and fun about it.
So I was going to say, listeners, Greg is very much enjoying this sort of sexy scene in the bar. But if should that end and he waver, feel free to send emails to books@nytimes.com. We've gotten some of them, and I forward them all on to Greg to
I
help
love
encourage
getting
him.
these emails as encouragement. I don't know that I've responded yet, but people are sending suggestions of audio versions and of other, biographies and other books to read.
It's like
and
the people who
it goads me. It's leading the breadcrumbs along. Yeah.
It's like handing paper cups of water to a marathon runner and just splash it in your face to keep yourself going.
Lauren, what are you reading?
I'm reading Portrait of a Novel by Michael Gora, which is sort of a book about a book. It's about Henry James's The Portrait of a Lady, which is my favorite book of all time. I wrote my college thesis senior year on that book, and this book came out a year later. And in my research, I sort of stumbled across Gora, who's a professor, and I knew that he was doing the research for this book, and I was like, thank God it won't have been published yet, because I knew that it was going to just sort of intimidate me out of writing about this subject. But so, it's basically all about, it's a biography of a book, which I think is such an interesting project. And it's sort of the story of Isabel Archer, who is the protagonist, alongside the story of James and sort of the circumstances that went into his formulation of this really incredible 19th century character. And the thesis of the book so far, I'm about 100 pages in, but I know what the thesis is going to be, which is that this is, his great work. It was sort of his entree out of sort of being a middling, not middling, but, he was writing criticism and short stories, but this was his declaration of, I am going to be an author in history. And I think this book is really one of the first psychological novels as such. And it's so interesting to read now because I feel like that's all people are writing now is books. Well, so much of what I read by, young debut novelists right now is books in which nothing really happens. It's all just interiority of the character, especially female characters. But back in James's day, that was completely new. I mean, he was working alongside Dickens, right? It was just all plot and not a lot of mental space. And that just wasn't really in vogue at the time. And so, just to sort of see the forebear of so much of what we're reading now back in the 19th century is just really fascinating to me. And I know John recently read Portrait of a Lady too.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned it briefly on the podcast. I talked more about the novel rather than the biography of the
Yeah.
novel, but they were both, I mean, it's really smart and well done. And if you read it right after reading the novel, it's particularly rewarding.
Exactly. And I love the lineage he sets up between George Eliot and then who influences James, who then influences people like Edith Wharton and Virginia Woolf. I mean, it's just such an interesting time. It makes me want to read Elizabeth Gaskell, because I sort of overlooked her as sort of in my study of the 19th century, I didn't really think about her, but I definitely want to go back and read.
So Pamela, you have another brick in front of you.
Yeah, I have the same brick that I've had for the last podcast or two. So I'm reading The English and Their History by Robert Toombs, and I'm
You're making much better progress than Greg is.
Wow.
You're really speeding through this.
Not to be competitive, but yes, I am definitely ahead of
There's
Greg.
maybe a little less wordplay in the Robert Toombs.
Yeah, this is about, I think, 900 pages or so. So I'm past the halfway mark. But what's interesting is that, he gets through the first, several millennia of English history by about, page 400. And then the last 600 pages are about the last 150 or so years. So he's definitely more interested in modern history, at least in this book. But his approach is interesting in a few ways. One is that, the book is called The English and Their History. It's not the British and Their History. And what he's trying to do is kind of isolate England as a nation, really separate from the United Kingdom, and to trace its history separately. And so in certain periods of time, that's more difficult to do than in others, obviously, especially after, they are united under the British Empire. And in the period that I'm in now, which is when the UK really does become a world empire. So that's interesting. And another thing that's different about his approach that I really appreciate is that he's writing as much about the historiography of English history as he is about the history itself. So he's constantly taking a step back to look at how the English assess their own history and how that assessment has changed over time. So, when you get to something like the War of the Roses, he'll say, well, of course, we didn't even, nobody called it the War of the Roses until, 200 years later. So that's something that marks it, I think, from other histories. But there are, and another thing I do appreciate is that he really takes care to focus on cultural history and literary history as much as political history. But it's a funny book. It's not entirely clear who it's written for, although I will say that I think it's pretty clearly written for an English or at least or British audience, insofar as he'll throw in phrases that are clearly, sort of touchstones for anyone probably who's grown up in England and been educated in the British school system, but for us is very obscure and assumed knowledge, So it would be like someone saying, like, remember the Alamo in the middle of a thing and then never explaining, like, what Texas was, So you
as somebody who's a non-British reader are needing to kind of track down references that he doesn't explain.
A lot
it's so funny because I really hate Google reading. I try to stay off of Google when I'm reading a book and wait until after so that I can kind of assess the book in and of itself. And with this book, that's particularly hard because somebody said something about the author on social media that has completely colored my way of reading this book. And I don't know that it's true because I'm not Googling it. I'm deliberately not Googling it because I don't want to really know more until after.
I have a question that's maybe related to that, which is about the intention of the book and how when you write a book about a people, is he trying to identify something that he thinks already exists? Is he trying to put a frame around it and, kind of like Blood and Soil, like this is the English character? And maybe that's what you saw on
it was
social media.
something about that sort of the contemporary ramifications of that I'm trying to stay a little bit away from until I get up to the contemporary period.
Yeah.
But now knowing something of his contemporary politics is sort of hard to read, or at least what someone has said about his contemporary politics, which is to say, I should just come out with it. They said that he is pro-Brexit. And so now, of course, I'm like, how does that show up during the Dickensian England?
Right, so he's making the case for English exceptionalism.
Perhaps,
in the same way. Yeah.
Perhaps. The book came out in 2015. The timing is interesting. But I think that at least ostensibly, I think what he's trying to do is to assess whether there is something that is a sort of intrinsic English character, English identity, English history, English people, separate from Scotland, Wales, Ireland, etc.
Yeah.
So, I'll finish it before you finish yours, Greg. I promise not to be here again with this book.
I don't know.
No, I'm not going to say
week.
that. I'm not going to say that.
We have to know the
By
contemporary
Labor
stuff.
Day.
Yeah, you've really
That's right.
planted a seed now.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thank you.
Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.